pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Years when Jefferson was literally tested by fire, and which helped shape the man and the president that he became. I didn't really understand at the beginning what that meant, so I wanted to know the whole story, and then I think about what it meant and how it shaped him. So the main thing I thought was that this is a thrilling story, a thrilling narrative that I could make into a story that not only historians would be interested, but hopefully the general reader, just on its own 2 feet, whether you are interested in the revolution or not. So I wanted to go right at the heart of what happened when Benedict Arnold invaded Virginia. Of course, when I came here, I read all of Jefferson's letters. They're collected in books, and a lot of the originals are here, and other documents are here. And that told me Jefferson's side of the story. And then I learned that there was a book called The Revolutionary War Correspondence of Benedict Arnold. So I thought, great, now I'll have Arnold's side of the story. The problem is that it ends when Arnold becomes a traitor. So the last letter you see in this book, or one of the last, is him telling the American public, join me and let's overthrow the American government. And it ends there. However, there are a lot of letters that he wrote, and so I was sitting down in the manuscript room in this building, and I found a rather obscure volume of letters that British officers wrote, and there was a letter, several letters that Arnold wrote to his superiors in which he described how he left New York with 27 ships and 1,600 men in December of 1780. And this is about 4 years after the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of people may think of 1776 as the Revolution's won. Hardly so. Jefferson's governor of Virginia. He's serving his second term. It's December of 1780. And he has no idea that Benedict Arnold, a man whom he once called a fine sailor, in fact, a man he thought would be the key to beating the British, had turned traitor just weeks earlier. And Arnold had gone to the British commander in New York and said, if we can cut off Virginia, if we can cut off supplies to the south, then we can win the war. Virginia was the most powerful state, the largest state, and yet it only had 2 brief invasions lasting only days, and the British had left. So Jefferson, as governor, thought that, well, the British come, they come for a couple of days, and they leave. Virginia hadn't had to suffer like other states, like Massachusetts or South Carolina, for example. So he thought he was rather secure. He did know, however, that if the British did come again, that Virginia was ill-prepared for an invasion. The Navy had been denuded in the previous 2 invasions. The militia were poorly armed. They were poorly fed, poorly equipped. They came out for 3-month terms, but they were concerned if they came out that their families and farms might be in danger. So it was difficult to get them to turn out for more than the term that they were supposed to turn out for 3 months. So in theory, Jefferson thought he could rely on the militia. He did not like the idea of a strong standing army. He was concerned about it, tyranny taking over, which is why he had the revolution in the first place. So when Arnold's coming into Virginia, Jefferson's not prepared. And he prefers to think that it's just not going to happen. So right around New Year's Day of 1781, in fact, Arnold does come in, and there's a sailor with the Virginia Navy. He's on a small ship. It's called the Liberty. And he looks up and he sees these 27 ships in the bay, and he immediately goes to the shoreline and he writes a note. He's saying he saw 27 sail, and he asked someone at the shoreline to please get the message to Richmond, the capital of Virginia. And so this messenger goes, and they have 40-mile horse rides, and they change the message off and off and off. And a very weary rider finally ascends Shockoe Hill in Richmond, and he finds Governor Jefferson. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, out in his garden, out by the townhouse where the governor lived at the time. And Jefferson looked at the message with a warning of 27 sail, and he said, well, we don't really know if this is the British. Maybe it's the Allied French fleet, which he'd been hoping would come. Or he said, perhaps it's a foraging party. 27 ships, but that's what he said. He said, perhaps it's a foraging party. And the main thing is that he had called out the militia before, and the militia did not like to be called out unnecessarily. So he was concerned that if he did, that there would be a backlash. He didn't want to do it unless he was certain. But the reality is, unimpeachable evidence in a time of war, at the time of the Revolution, was difficult to come by. So he did not want to assume the worst, but he wanted to take it cautiously. He sent some people out to get intelligence, see what more could be learned, to get definitive information. And there wasn't at the time, to him, to be fair, that this was the British. So this sets the stage for the story. Jefferson's in Richmond, 100 or so miles away. Arnold's fleet's there, and they are, in fact, going up the James River. Now, this part of the story, if you read biographies of Jefferson and Arnold, you might get a little bit of the story. But what struck me as I decided to work on this was, well, what was happening? Because if you read the histories, first of all, the first 2 days of the invasion, when Jefferson didn't know what was going on, are basically blank. It was not known what happened. There didn't seem to be records of what happened. So I was interested to see, as a reporter, could I find out something about what happened? So I put on my sort of investigative reporter cap, and I thought maybe I can figure out what happened by going through methodically who was on those 27 ships. So I found out here that the Navy Historical Society, just down the street of the Navy Yard, had some ship's logs, and I went there. And then I went further. They told me that you could get more ship's logs through the British National Archives. So I contacted them, and I obtained more ship's logs from the National Archives in London. And at that point, I made a list of the 27 ships and also the officers on those ships. And basically, to make a long story short, I cross-referenced the names of the officers on those ships with known journals by any officer who ever served for the British that I could determine. So matching these up, finally, I found a couple of journals that told me a little bit more about what happened. And in fact, there was one journal in particular by an officer named Bartholomew James, bless him. He basically wrote a journal that had very little about Virginia, except there were a couple of pages of very vivid description. He was on one of these ships. His journal was about other parts of history, so it was filed elsewhere. But he did give us the first insight that I know of what really happened in those first 2 days. And he told a rather amazing story. In those first 2 days, the British were attacking local citizens. They went ashore, and Arnold took 300 men and marched inland. And they started taking Virginians out of their beds. Any Virginian they saw, they were concerned would warn Jefferson and the people in Richmond that they were coming. So they took them out of their beds. In fact, he wrote that we, quote, took the principal inhabitants out of their beds amidst the deep cries of the family where they were staying. So while it was thought that maybe they just came up the James River, in fact, there were a lot of clashes going on. Local militia, who were thought to basically be scurrying away, in fact, were trying to meet them. Militia would come to the shoreline very poorly armed, and they would fire their muskets, or they had hatchets and swords. They clearly couldn't take on this enormous British fleet with all their cannons. So they did the best they could, and they tried to send more messages up. So 2 days later, Jefferson is still in Richmond wondering what's going on, and he writes, no intelligence. He still doesn't know what's happening, even though all these clashes are going on. So let me just give you one more example. And I've been doing this all from memory, so now I want to pick up where I've reminded myself what to say. So Jefferson is is still unclear. It takes several days for Arnold to get up the James River. There's one crucial point, and I found this to be one of the most important things in writing this book, and that is there's a place called Hood's Point on the James River. It's about 25, 30 miles from Richmond, and it's the place where the James River, which is a big funnel at the coast, sort of narrows in, and there's a high point of land. And from the promontory, it was thought if you put a fort up there that you could shoot down, it's like a shooting gallery, and stop any advancing fleet. And it was the perfect location for a fort. A year earlier, Jefferson, to his credit, had said, let's build a fort there to make sure that we can stop an invading fleet. And 2 months earlier, he basically said, to the legislature, stop messing around. We really need this fort there. There was a shell of a fort. There were 90 militiamen, but there were no match for this fleet, no match whatsoever. And very easily, the fleet got past Hood Point. And at that point, the messengers who were there went to Richmond again and said, it's Benedict Arnold. There's a fleet of many ships. It's overwhelming. And at that point, Jefferson does call out as many militiamen as he can. But it's really too late to stop the initial invasion. The invasion basically gets all the way to Virginia, and Jefferson has to take flight from Richmond. In fact, one slave who remained in Richmond said that there wasn't a white person left in Richmond. So Jefferson, in fact, took his wife and their young children, and he may have saved their lives. He took them up the James River and put them at one house, and then he thought the British were coming, and he took them from that house and took them to another. And he rode around on horseback for several days while a lot of people were fleeing, and Jefferson himself was not in Richmond. In fact, he was ensuring the safety of his family and moving around papers and arms. So you can look at that and say that this was an amazing thing. He was not known for being a military person. He himself said that he had no military training and he wasn't leading a force in battle, but he didn't just run away. He did, in fact, stay there and take some very important action by hiding arms, hiding papers, taking care of his family, and remaining around the area. And he said during this entire time, he later wrote that during this entire time, he wasn't assisted by a single Virginian of the military, that he was on his own on a horse riding around, and he was a great horseman. So it gives you a little different picture of Thomas Jefferson than the Jefferson we know as a sort of perhaps quiet, shy man writing his Declaration. He was a very athletic man. He was a man who loved to ride his horse. He wasn't prepared to take on an army, but and he did wait too long to take action. But he didn't run away. He did stay around and try to make things as best as he could. One other discovery I want to mention in writing this, and that is, I mentioned that the journal of Bartholomew James, the British officer, was key in getting a little bit better picture of what happened during this invasion. There's one other diary in particular that I found to be absolutely essential, and it's a diary not by a British officer, but by a Hessian officer who assisted the British named Johann von Ewald. And the reason this is so important is that Ewald's diary was not actually found until after World War II, was not translated and published until the 1970s, and as far as I could tell, had not been used in histories of the invasion of Virginia, although it has been used in other histories of other actions during the Revolutionary War. And Ewald is right there by Benedict Arnold's side, and he sees things that just simply most people don't realize were going on. And so as a writer, I'm putting together pieces of the puzzle, and Ewald is a very, very important piece. And I look at his diary as one of the most important documents of the Revolutionary War, and I write in my acknowledgments that I hope, if I do nothing else, that I bring attention to things like the diary of Ewald. The book's out of print, but it is available in certain places and at libraries. So let me give you an example, just a quote from what Ewald wrote, to give you an example of Ewald's importance. Okay, at one point, Arnold wrote to his superiors, talking of the Battle of Richmond, that there was very little damage. Some things happened, but it wasn't that big a deal. Ewald, who was also there, wrote that the British, quote, ravaged and laid waste everything. Terrible things happened on this excursion. Churches and holy places were plundered. Half the place was in flames. It's a different picture than we've gotten of the invasion of Richmond. It's maybe the way we think of what happened in the Civil War in Richmond. I'm not saying it was as big as the Civil War, obviously it was not, but it gives you a better sense of what was actually going on in Richmond. All of the white people had fled. The British were there. There was a lot of plundering. They actually took Jefferson's slaves who had remained behind from Jefferson's townhouse and took them along as part of the British prisoner group. one other example, which I think is one of the most vivid examples. At one point, Arnold wrote to his superiors that there were many loyalists in Virginia. And in fact, they were all happy and eager to see Benedict Arnold arrive. And 400 residents in Portsmouth, for example, took pledges of loyalty to the king, Arnold wrote. Avald, who was also there, had a different perspective. He described the same scene this way. As the Virginians promised loyalty, many made, quote, wry faces as though they would choke on it. Time and again, you match up these different things. You see what Jefferson wrote, you see what Arnold wrote and other officers wrote, and Avald comes along. And yes, he's fighting on the British side, but like a lot of British officers, he did not admire Arnold. He did not admire someone who was a traitor. They thought he could help him, but he really wasn't liked by either side. Jefferson called Arnold a parricide, one who murders his country, basically.
You can see the writing on the pavement. Young kids, they're growing up in basements. Online, a whole new generation. I'ma make mine, so you better go take it. Always they need a new replacement. Decentralized, can't contain it. We're changing lives, yeah, upgrading. Call it suicide of the older generation.
What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. Yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling it wrong. You got me like, oh yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling it wrong.
Hey, it's too late to try to go contain it. A generation fueled by creation. We live lives on a small screen nation. We control the airwaves, no negotiation. I refuse to think we need saving. Something good will come from creation. And when we think that the world is too anxious, we'll adapt, evolve, survive, and save it.
What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah.